The blood-red sunset painted the dusty plains of Wyoming territory as Quentin Nash stared at the wooden cross marking his brother's grave. The year was 1878, and Green River had seen its share of death since the Union Pacific Railroad had cut through 3 years prior. Quentin had ridden for 4 days straight after receiving word that his younger brother Thomas had been shot dead in a saloon dispute. Now, standing in the cemetery on the edge of town, he found himself unable to take another step toward the freshly turned earth. He couldn't explain why he'd pulled off his boots. Perhaps it was an old superstition his Irish grandmother had spoken of, that to walk barefoot on the earth where your kin lay allowed their spirit to recognize you. Or maybe it was simply that grief had made him lose his senses. The sharp rocks and hard-packed soil bit into his calloused feet as he stood frozen between the crooked rows of markers. "You can walk forward now," a soft voice said behind him. Quentin turned to find a young woman standing a few paces away, a bundle of wildflowers clutched in her gloved hands. Her dark blue dress was plain but well kept, her honey blonde hair tucked neatly beneath a modest bonnet. She regarded him with eyes that seemed to understand his hesitation. "It's just. Once I stand at his grave, it becomes real," Quentin admitted, his voice hoarse from days of traveled dust and unshed tears. "I know," she said simply. "I'm Penelope Porter, the school teacher. Your brother taught my students to play the harmonica last spring." Quentin nodded, the lump in his throat growing. Thomas had always been good with children, with his easy laugh and patient ways. Unlike Quentin, who'd spent the years since the war drifting from ranch to ranch, Thomas had been putting down roots in Green River. "I bring flowers every Sunday," Penelope continued. "For my parents and now for Thomas too. He was kind to everyone." Quentin finally took those steps forward, the earth cool beneath his bare feet. Thomas's grave was marked by a simple wooden cross, his name carved with obvious care. Someone had already placed a small bunch of wildflowers at its base. "The children," Penelope explained, seeing his gaze. "They come sometimes." He made an impression. They stood in silence as the last rays of sunlight disappeared behind the distant mountains. Quentin realized he was still holding his boots, dangling uselessly from his hand like the words he couldn't bring himself to say over his brother's grave. "There's a boarding house in town," Penelope offered as darkness fell. "Mrs. Holloway's. Clean beds, fair prices. She was fond of Thomas too." Quentin nodded, finally bending to pull his boots back on. "Thank you, Miss Porter. It's just penny to friends," she said. Then, more quietly, "Thomas spoke of you, said you were the strongest man he knew." Quentin's throat tightened. He was wrong about that. "I don't think so," she replied, placing her wildflowers beside the children's offering. "Strong men feel their grief. It's the weak ones who run from it." She left him there in the growing dark, her silhouette fading toward town. Quentin remained, saying a silent goodbye to the brother he hadn't seen in 3 years, wondering what it was about Green River that had made Thomas want to stay, and what it was about the schoolteacher's steady gaze that made him think he might find out. The sheriff's office was a simple clapboard building on Green River's Main Street. Quentin pushed through the door the next morning, greeted by a heavyset man with a star pinned to his vest who looked up from his paperwork. "Sheriff Miller," the man introduced himself. "You must be Thomas Nash's brother." "Quentin Nash," he confirmed. "I'm here about my brother's murder." The sheriff's face tightened. "Not much to tell that ain't been told. Your brother was playing cards at the White River Saloon. Man accused him of cheating, words were exchanged, and guns were drawn. Your brother wasn't as quick. Who killed him?" "Fella named Harlan Black. Professional gambler, not local, been through these parts before, never much trouble until that night." "Where is he now?" The sheriff's eyes narrowed. "Now you listen here, Nash, I know that look. You didn't ride all this way to attend a funeral that's already happened. You came looking for vengeance." "I came for justice," Quentin corrected. "Black's been charged. Trial's set for next month when the circuit judge comes through. Man's sitting in my jail right now." Quentin's jaw clenched. "So you're telling me to wait?" "I'm telling you Green River is a law-abiding town now. Railroad brought civilization. We don't settle scores with 6-shooters anymore." Quentin hadn't missed the emphasis on anymore. The sheriff was studying him closely. "Word is you were pretty handy with a gun during the war and after." That was a long time ago, Quentin said, though they both knew it wasn't that long. 10 years since Appomattox, 8 since he'd ridden with a group of former soldiers turned hired guns before walking away from that life. Keep it that way, Sheriff Miller advised. You want to see your brother's killer face justice? Be in that courtroom next month. Meanwhile, I hear Thomas left a small ranch outside town. Maybe see to his affairs instead of causing new ones. Quentin left the sheriff's office with directions to his brother's property and a warning ringing in his ears. The main street of Green River bustled with morning activity, the general store doing brisk business, a smithy hammering away at his forge, ladies in calico dresses exchanging gossip outside the post office. As he passed the schoolhouse, a bell rang and children poured into the yard. Penelope Porter stood in the doorway, her honey blonde hair now visible as she'd replaced yesterday's bonnet with a simpler ribbon. She caught his eye and nodded in recognition. An impulse made him cross the street toward her. Miss Porter, Mr. Nash. She smiled politely as her students scattered to play. Did you find Mrs. Holloway's accommodations satisfactory? Yes, madam. He removed his hat, turning it awkwardly in his hands. I was hoping you might tell me more about my brother. Seems everyone in town knew Thomas better than I did these past few years. A shadow passed over her face. I'm sorry about that. Thomas spoke highly of you, though, said you'd had a difficult time after the war. That's putting it kindly, Quentin admitted. Sheriff tells me Thomas had a small ranch. I aim to see it today. It's a lovely spot, she said. About 3 miles north of town along Pine Creek, he was building something good there. A small boy tugged at her skirts, interrupting them with an urgent question about a disputed game rule. She listened seriously before delivering a Solomon-like judgment that sent him scampering away satisfied. They adore you, Quentin observed. Children are honest in their affections, she replied. It's adults who complicate things. She glanced at the position of the sun. Recess ends soon, but... If you'd like, I could show you to Thomas's ranch after school lets out. Around 4 o'clock. I'd appreciate that, Quentin said, surprised at himself for accepting help. He'd spent years handling everything alone. I'll meet you at the livery, she said, then turned as more children demanded her attention. Quentin spent the next hours acquainting himself with Green River. The town had grown since the railroad's arrival, with new buildings springing up alongside structures that had clearly stood since the first settlers. He visited the White River Saloon, studying the spot where his brother had fallen, listening to the bartender's account that matched the sheriff's. At 4 o'clock, he waited outside the livery stable with 2 saddled horses. Penelope appeared promptly, having changed from her teaching clothes into a practical riding skirt. She mounted easily, showing the confidence of someone raised in the saddle. You ride well, he commented as they left town, heading north. My father insisted, she said. He claimed no daughter of his would be helpless on horseback in Wyoming territory. Were your parents homesteaders? Father was the first doctor in Green River. Mother taught school before me. Her voice held old grief. Influenza took them both 3 winters ago. I'm sorry, Quentin said, understanding now her comment about bringing flowers to the cemetery. They rode in companionable silence, the landscape opening before them vast grasslands punctuated by stands of cottonwood and willow along creek beds. The mountains loomed to the west, still capped with snow even in late spring. There, Penelope pointed after they'd ridden about 3 miles. A small cabin came into view, nestled in a protected hollow alongside a clear running creek. A corral stood empty beside a modest barn, and beyond them stretched fenced pastureland where a dozen cattle grazed. It wasn't much compared to the great ranches farther north, but Quentin could see it was a solid start and more permanence than he'd allowed himself in years. Thomas was proud of this place, Penelope said as they dismounted. Paid for it in full last year. Said he finally had something worth writing home about. Quentin swallowed hard. I never got that letter. Maybe because you never stayed in one place long enough. There was no judgment in her voice, just a gentle observation. The cabin door was secured with a simple latch. Inside, Quentin found a single room with a neatly made bed, a small table with 2 chairs, and a cast iron stove. A bookshelf held more volumes than he would have expected: history, poetry, and practical guides to ranching. A harmonica rested atop them. "He played beautifully," Penelope said from the doorway. "The children would beg him for songs whenever he came to town." On the table sat a framed tintype: Thomas and Quentin in their Union blue, Thomas barely 18 and Quentin 23, both looking solemn and uncertain before heading east to join the fighting. Beside it lay a letter, unsealed and addressed simply to Quentin, wherever he might be. Penelope tactfully stepped outside as Quentin picked up the letter with trembling hands. His brother's flowing script filled a single page. "Quentin, I hope this finds you well, though God knows where you might be these days. I've sent letters to every town I've heard might have seen you, but they always seem to arrive after you've moved on. I'm writing to invite you to Green River, not just for a visit this time, but to stay. This land has been good to me, and there's room here for both of us to build something permanent. The war has been over for 10 years, brother. Perhaps it's time we both stopped running from its ghosts. I've met someone, Lily Blackwood, from over in Rawlins. She's agreed to marry me come autumn. I'd very much like my brother to stand with me on that day. Your brother always." Thomas Quentin sank into a chair, the letter clutched in his fist. Grief and regret crashed over him anew. Not only had he lost his brother, but he'd missed so much of his life: his happiness, his plans for the future, even the woman he'd intended to marry. A knock at the open door pulled him from his thoughts. Penelope stood there, her expression sympathetic. "He never mentioned being engaged," Quentin said. "It was recent," she replied, "just last month. Lily Blackwood is a lovely girl. Her father owns the mercantile in Rawlins. She's devastated, of course, returned to her parents after what happened." "I need to meet her," Quentin decided. "Pay my respects," Penelope nodded. "Rawlins is 30 miles east. Stage goes there Tuesdays and Fridays." They secured the cabin and rode back toward town as the afternoon light began to soften. Quentin found himself studying the land with new eyes, not as a temporary stopping point, but as the place his brother had chosen to call home. "What will you do with the ranch?" Penelope asked as the buildings of Green River came into view. "I don't know," Quentin admitted. "I haven't stayed in one place long enough to tend a garden, let alone raise cattle." "Thomas believed people could change," she said quietly. "He said it often." At the livery stable, Quentin helped her down from her horse, her waist slender beneath his hands. Their eyes met briefly, something unspoken passing between them before she stepped back. "Thank you for showing me the way," he said. "Everyone needs guidance sometimes, Mr. Nash," she replied with a small smile. "Even stubborn cowboys who walk barefoot through cemeteries." As she turned to leave, Quentin called after her, "It's just Quinn to friends." She glanced back, her smile widening just slightly. "Good night then, Quinn." The Tuesday stagecoach to Rawlins departed at dawn, rumbling east along the same route the Union Pacific trains followed. Quentin sat wedged between a traveling salesman and an elderly woman returning from visiting her grandchildren. Across from him, a young couple whispered and held hands, oblivious to their fellow passengers. The journey took most of the day, the coach stopping at noon to change horses at a lonely station where passengers stretched their legs and ate a hasty meal. By late afternoon, they rolled into Rawlins, a town similar to Green River but with more substantial buildings, having been established as a division point for the railroad. Quentin made inquiries and found his way to Blackwood's Mercantile, a large store on the town's main street. Inside, a balding man with spectacles was assisting a customer with fabric. When the transaction concluded, Quentin approached. "Mr. Blackwood?" he asked. The man studied him cautiously. "I am. My name is Quentin Nash. Thomas Nash was my brother." Blackwood's face registered surprise, then genuine sympathy. "Mr. Nash, I'm sorry for your loss. Thomas was, well, he was to be my son-in-law, a fine young man. I'd like to pay my respects to your daughter if she's willing." The merchant hesitated. "Lily has taken it very hard." "Perhaps tomorrow. Our home is just behind the store. Come for supper at 6. Quentin agreed and found lodging at a nearby hotel. The next evening, he arrived at the Blackwood home precisely at 6, hat in hand, wearing his one clean shirt. "Mrs. Blackwood, A plump woman with a kind face welcomed him warmly, ushering him into a comfortable parlor. Lily Blackwood entered a few minutes later, a slender young woman with dark hair and porcelain skin reddened around the eyes from recent tears. She couldn't have been more than 20. "Miss Blackwood," Quentin bowed slightly, "I'm very sorry about Thomas. He was the best of men." "He spoke of you often," she said softly. "Said you were the bravest man he knew." Quentin swallowed hard. "My brother was generous with his praise." Dinner was a somber affair, though the Blackwoods made efforts at polite conversation, asking about his journey and his impression of Wyoming territory. It was clear they had genuinely cared for Thomas and welcomed the connection his brother had planned to forge between their families. After the meal, Lily asked if he would walk with her in the garden. In the twilight, surrounded by her mother's rose bushes, she seemed even more fragile. "I loved your brother very much, Mr. Nash," she said, her voice steady despite her grief. "We were to be married in September." "I only just learned of your engagement," Quentin admitted. "I found Thomas's letter to me. He was very happy." She nodded, a tear slipping down her cheek. "What will happen to the man who killed him? He'll face trial next month," Quentin assured her. "Did you know this, Harlan Black?" Her face hardened. "Only that he's a gambler who travels the railroad towns. Thomas wasn't a cheater, Mr. Nash. He played cards for enjoyment, not profit." "I believe you," Quentin said. "The sheriff in Green River seems confident about the case." Lily twisted her hands together. "Will you attend the trial?" "Yes," Quentin promised. "I'll see justice done for Thomas." Later, as he prepared to leave, Mr. Blackwood pressed something into his hand, a small velvet box containing a modest diamond ring. "Thomas bought this for Lily," the merchant explained. "Paid for it in full. Under the circumstances, it should return to his family." Quentin tried to refuse, but Blackwood insisted. "Perhaps someday you'll have use for it yourself," he said kindly. The stagecoach returned him to Green River on Friday evening. As he walked from the station to Mrs. Holloway's boarding house, he passed the schoolhouse where a lamp still burned in the window. Through the glass, he could see Penelope Porter at her desk, bent over papers. Without really deciding to, Quentin found himself knocking at the schoolhouse door. She looked up, startled, then came to let him in. "You're back," she said. "How was your journey?" "Educational," he replied. "The Blackwoods are good people. They cared for Thomas." She nodded, gesturing for him to sit in one of the student chairs while she returned to her desk. "Did it help?" "Meeting them? It made Thomas's life here more real to me," Quentin admitted. "And his death." Penelope set down her marking pencil. "Have you decided what you'll do about the ranch?" "I've been thinking about that," Quentin said slowly. "Thomas wanted me to stay. Wrote asking me to join him here. And now he's gone, but his dream isn't. That land is paid for, cattle are there, someone needs to tend them." "You don't strike me as a rancher," Penelope observed. Quentin smiled ruefully. "I've been many things, Miss Porter. Soldier, drifter, occasional gun hand, never stayed anywhere long enough to put down roots. Maybe it's time I tried." She studied him thoughtfully. "Roots take time to grow and care." "I'm learning patience," he said. "What are you working on so late?" "Geography tests," she sighed. "The children try, but few of them can properly place the eastern states on a map. Wyoming feels like the entire world to them." "It's big enough," Quentin agreed. "Mind if I help? I've seen most of those states firsthand." Surprise flickered across her face, but she nodded, pushing half the stack toward him. They worked in companionable silence, the scratch of their pencils the only sound. Occasionally, their hands would brush as they reached for the same paper, and Quentin found himself increasingly aware of her presence, the faint lavender scent of her, the graceful movement of her hands, the loose tendril of honey blonde hair that kept falling across her cheek. "You're good at this," she commented when they finished, "patient with their mistakes." "Thomas was the patient one," Quentin said. "I'm just trying to honor his memory by being a little less harsh than I used to be." "Is that why you're staying? For Thomas?" Quentin considered her question. "Partly, but also for myself. I've been running so long, I've forgotten what it feels like to belong somewhere." She gathered the graded papers, her movements deliberate. Green River could use more good men, especially those willing to learn patience. He walked her home in the gathering darkness to a small cottage near the church. On her porch, she turned to him with a question in her eyes. "Would you like to come to Sunday dinner after church?" she asked. Nothing fancy, but I make a decent chicken and dumplings." "I'd like that," Quentin said, surprised at how much he meant it. The next 2 weeks established a rhythm to Quentin's days. Mornings he spent at Thomas's ranch now, he supposed learning the business of cattle from neighboring ranchers who'd been friends with his brother. Afternoons often found him in town, sometimes helping with repairs at the schoolhouse or simply sitting on the porch of the general store, becoming part of the community in ways he hadn't experienced since before the war. Sundays became his favorite day, church services, followed by dinner at Penelope's cottage, where conversation flowed easily. He learned she'd come west with her parents at 14, that she loved teaching but dreamed of someday traveling to Boston or New York to see the great museums and libraries. He told her about his years of wandering, editing out the darkest parts but sharing enough that she understood why he'd never stayed in one place long. "You were running from yourself," she observed one Sunday as they washed dishes together, "not just from the memories of war." "You're too perceptive, Penny," he said, using her familiar name that now came naturally to his lips. "Teachers learn to see what isn't being said," she replied with a small smile. "Children are transparent, adults just think they're better at hiding." The circuit judge was due in Green River the following week. As the day approached, Quentin found himself increasingly tense, the old restlessness returning. The night before the trial, he couldn't sleep, eventually pulling on his boots and coat for a walk through the silent town. His feet carried him to the cemetery where he'd first met Penelope. The moon was nearly full, bathing the crooked rows of markers in silver light. Thomas's grave now had a proper headstone. Quentin had ordered it from a stonecutter in Cheyenne, using money he'd been saving for no particular purpose. "I'm trying, Thomas," he murmured to the silent stone, "to build something here like you wanted." "It's not easy, is it?" Penelope's voice came from behind him. Quentin turned, unsurprised somehow to find her there, wrapped in a shawl against the night chill. "Couldn't sleep either." She shook her head, coming to stand beside him. "I was worried about you. Tomorrow will be difficult." "I'm afraid of what I might do," Quentin admitted. "If the verdict isn't what it should be, you think they might acquit him. Justice isn't always just, Penny. I've seen that too often." She was quiet for a moment, then said, "Whatever happens tomorrow, remember you're building something here now, something that matters. Don't throw it away on vengeance." Her hand found his in the darkness, small and warm against his calloused palm. The simple contact anchored him, eased the churning in his chest. "I should get you home," he said reluctantly. "It's late." "Walk me there," she agreed. They crossed the town hand in hand, speaking little. At her door, Quentin hesitated, then bent and kissed her cheek gently. "Thank you," he said simply. "For what?" "For seeing something in me worth saving." The next morning, the courthouse was packed with townsfolk eager to witness the trial of Harlan Black. The accused sat at a table beside his lawyer, a slick-looking man from Cheyenne. Black himself was perhaps 40, well-dressed but with cold eyes that surveyed the room, calculating odds as any gambler would. Judge Harrington, a stern man with iron-gray hair, called the court to order. Quentin sat in the front row beside Sheriff Miller, who had insisted on staying close, just to ensure proceedings remain orderly. The prosecution presented a straightforward case. Multiple witnesses testified that Black had accused Thomas of cheating, that Thomas had denied it calmly, and that Black had drawn first. The defense argued that Thomas had made a move toward his weapon, forcing Black to defend himself. When Black himself took the stand, Quentin's hands clenched so tightly his knuckles whitened. The gambler spoke smoothly, presenting himself as a professional who recognized cheating when he saw it. He claimed self-defense, insisting Thomas had reached for his gun first. "He had a reputation to protect in this town," Black said with practiced regret. "I was just passing through, had nothing to gain by drawing on him except saving my own life." During cross-examination, the prosecutor asked, if Mr. Nash was cheating, why did none of the other players notice? Black shrugged. "They weren't professionals, I was. And you've been involved in similar altercations before, haven't you, Mr. Black?" "Objection," the defense lawyer interrupted. "Prior incidents are not relevant." "Goes to pattern of behavior, Your Honor," the prosecutor argued. Judge Harrington considered, then said, "I'll allow it. The witness will answer." Black shifted uncomfortably. "I've had disagreements in the past, hazard of my profession." "In fact," the prosecutor continued, "you've been involved in 3 fatal shootings in the past 5 years, all following accusations of cheating, all ruled self-defense due to lack of contrary witnesses." "Is that correct?" the courtroom murmured as Black's jaw tightened. "That's correct." The jury deliberated for just 2 hours before returning. Quentin held his breath as the foreman stood. "We find the defendant, Harlan Black, guilty of the murder of Thomas Nash." Relief flooded through Quentin as Judge Harrington sentenced Black to hang in 2 weeks' time. As the guards led the convicted man away, Black's cold eyes found Quentin's. "You look like him," he said. "Your brother, he had the same self-righteous expression when I shot him." Quentin lunged forward, but Sheriff Miller caught his arm. "Not worth it," the lawman muttered. "He's going to hang anyway." Outside the courthouse, townsfolk offered Quentin their condolences and congratulations on the verdict. Penelope waited at the edge of the crowd, her face showing the same relief he felt. "It's over," she said when he reached her. "Almost," Quentin replied. "2 more weeks until the sentence is carried out. What will you do now?" He took a deep breath, looking around at the town that was slowly becoming familiar. "Stay, build something, like Thomas wanted." Her smile was like sunrise. "I hoped you'd say that." The morning of the hanging dawned clear and cool. Quentin had debated whether to attend, but ultimately decided he needed to witness the final justice for his brother. The gallows had been constructed in the town square, and a substantial crowd had gathered not in celebration, but in solemn acknowledgement that the law had been upheld. Harlan Black climbed the steps steadily, his face impassive. When asked for final words, he simply shook his head. The drop was quick and clean, and something tight inside Quentin's chest finally loosened. It wasn't joy he felt, just the quiet certainty that Thomas's killer had faced consequences. Penelope stood beside him, her hand finding his as the crowd dispersed. "Are you all right?" she asked. "Yes," he said, realizing it was true. "It feels like I can finally look forward now, not back." That evening, he invited her to dinner at Thomas's cabin, his cabin now. He'd spent days cleaning and preparing, even bringing in wildflowers to brighten the table. They rode out together as the sun began its descent, painting the landscape in gold. "It's looking more lived in," she observed as they dismounted. "I'm trying," Quentin admitted. "Never was much for homemaking." He'd prepared a simple meal, beef stew and biscuits, nothing fancy but edible. Afterward, they sat on the porch, watching stars appear above the vast Wyoming sky. "I received a letter today," Penelope said, "from the territorial superintendent of schools. They've offered me a position in Cheyenne, better pay, newer schoolhouse." Quentin's heart sank. "Will you take it?" She turned to face him in the gathering darkness. "I've been in Green River since I was 14 years old. My parents are buried here. I've built a life here. But Cheyenne would offer more. You've talked about wanting to see more of the world." "There are different kinds of riches in life," she said softly. "I've found something in Green River these past months that matters more than a bigger school or proximity to Denver's libraries." Hope swelled in Quentin's chest. "What's that?" "The chance to build something meaningful. With someone who understands what that's worth." He took her hand, his thumb tracing circles on her palm. "I never thought I'd want to stay anywhere again. Never thought I deserved the kind of life Thomas was building. And now I think maybe he was right, that it's time to stop running from ghosts." Quentin reached into his pocket, withdrawing the small velvet box Mr. Blackwood had given him. "This was Thomas's ring for Lily. I've been carrying it, thinking about what he was brave enough to do that I never was." Penelope's eyes widened as he opened the box, revealing the modest diamond. "I know it's not traditional," Quentin said, suddenly nervous. "Using a ring meant for another woman, but Thomas would want it to symbolize love and hope, not just memories." "It's perfect," she whispered. "Penny Porter, I've only known you a few months, but in that time you've shown me what it means to put down roots, to believe in something again." His voice caught. "Would you consider building a life here with me, becoming my wife?" Her answer was to lean forward and press her lips to his, a kiss that held promise and affirmation. When they parted, both breathing quickly, she took the ring from its box and slipped it onto her finger. Yes, she said simply, on one condition. Name it. That we visit Thomas's grave together before the wedding, so he knows. Quentin's throat tightened with emotion. He'd like that. They were married that September in the Green River Church with half the town in attendance. Lily Blackwood came from Rawlins, her grief softened enough to offer genuine congratulations. Sheriff Miller gave a toast at the reception, joking that he'd never expected the Barefoot Cowboy in the cemetery to become one of Green River's most respected ranchers. After the celebration, they returned to the ranch that was now truly theirs. As twilight fell, Penelope Nash suggested they visit the small cemetery one more time. Hand in hand, they walked among the markers. When they reached Thomas's grave, Quentin removed his boots without thinking, the gesture now a ritual of respect. "Thank you, Thomas," he said softly, "for showing me the way home." Penelope squeezed his hand. "You can walk forward now," she said, echoing her words from that first evening. "We both can." And they did, stepping into the future they would build together on Wyoming soil. 5 years later, Green River had grown considerably. The railroad had brought more settlers, more businesses, and more opportunities. The Nash Ranch had prospered too, expanding from Thomas's original herd to a respectable operation that employed 3 ranch hands and produced some of the finest cattle in the territory. Quentin stood on his porch, watching his 4-year-old son Thomas named for his Uncle chase butterflies in the yard, while 2-year-old Alina toddled after him on unsteady legs. From inside the cabin came the sound of Penelope singing as she prepared dinner, her voice clear and sweet in the summer evening. Life wasn't always easy. Wyoming winters were harsh, cattle prices fluctuated, and the work was endless. But each hardship overcome strengthened the roots they'd planted together in this soil. Quentin had learned that running wasn't the answer, that facing life's challenges alongside someone you loved made even the difficult days worthwhile. Once a month, the family visited the cemetery together. They'd place wildflowers on Thomas's grave and on the plots where Penelope's parents lay. Quentin would remove his boots and walk barefoot among the markers, teaching his children that remembering those who came before was an act of respect and love, not just grief. "They're part of who we are," he'd explain. "Your Uncle Thomas helped bring your mama and me together, even though he was already in heaven." Young Thomas would nod solemnly, not fully understanding but accepting the ritual's importance. Alina would typically insist on removing her own tiny shoes, giggling as the grass tickled her feet. On one such visit, as they were preparing to leave, young Thomas asked, "Papa, why do you always take off your boots here?" Quentin exchanged a glance with Penelope, who smiled encouragement. "Because sometimes," he explained, kneeling to his son's level, "we need to feel connected to the earth where our loved ones rest, and because it reminds me of the day I met your mama." "She told you to walk forward," his son said, repeating the story he'd heard many times. "That's right. And it was the best advice anyone ever gave me." Penelope slipped her hand into his as they walked back toward their horses. "I never imagined that evening that we'd be here now," she said quietly, "with a family, a home, a future. I never imagined staying anywhere long enough to have any of it," Quentin admitted. "You changed everything, Penny." "We changed each other," she corrected gently. "That's what love does, it transforms us into better versions of ourselves." As they rode home, Quentin with Thomas secured before him on the saddle and Penelope with Alina, he looked out over the land that had become his legacy, not just the ranch, but the community they'd helped build, the family they'd created, the love they'd cultivated through seasons of plenty and want. He thought of the barefoot, grieving cowboy he'd been that first evening in the cemetery, unable to move forward, trapped between past and future. And he thought of the schoolteacher with honest eyes who'd seen something worth saving in him, who'd given him the courage to take those steps. The sun set behind the distant mountains, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks that reflected off the creek running through their property. Young Thomas pointed excitedly at a fox slipping through the tall grass, and Alina clapped her tiny hands in delight. "This," Quentin thought, "is what Thomas wanted for me, for both of us." And as they approached their home, smoke curling invitingly from the chimney, lanterns glowing in windows that had been dark for too long before Penelope brought light into his life. Quentin Nash knew with absolute certainty that he'd finally found where he belonged. He would never again need to wander barefoot through cemeteries, searching for connection. He'd found it here in the land, in his family, in the woman who'd taught him that moving forward didn't mean forgetting the past, but honoring it by building something worthy of those who'd gone before. As they dismounted and the children ran ahead to the house, Penelope turned to him with a knowing smile. "What are you thinking about so seriously?" "About how far we've come," he said, drawing her close, "and how grateful I am for that evening in the cemetery." "Even the sharp rocks under your bare feet," she teased. "Even those," he laughed. "They were part of the path that led me to you." She stood on tiptoe to kiss him, their children calling impatiently from the porch for them to hurry. The family they'd built waited, and Quentin Nash, once a drifter, now firmly rooted, walked forward to meet them, every step sure and purposeful on the ground that had become his home.